Here in section 19, we're going to provide that last lead up to our more detailed case study on calculating landed costs. Here, we're going to continue with our methodology and go into just a little bit more detail before we do that. As discussed earlier, the key to calculating an item-specific landed cost is driven by the ability to translate expenses that use different units of measure into a prorated dollar-denominated figure. Let's say that one more time. Translate all the different expenses, the inputs that we spoke of, that by their very nature use different units of measure, into a prorated dollar-denominated figure. As a quick note, for purposes of the upcoming landed cost calculation, we will use a basic example that employs average costs, rounded as well, for full container load ocean shipments. As we've said a couple of times now, and we'll repeat again here without apology, in general terms, the expenses and units of measure that must be isolated include the following: the unit cost of the item as expressed on a dollar basis, transportation-related costs on a per cubic meter basis, any ancillary transportation charges per shipment, documentation and service fees, which are also levied on a per shipment basis, and customs duties, which are normally charged as a percentage of the value of the goods. A quick trade tip to throw in: an important best practice is to first calculate each cost by its unit of measure, and once all are expressed on that dollar basis, then add them to the unit cost to arrive at landed cost. In terms of the steps for calculating landed cost, let's focus in on ocean transportation and what constitutes that expense. To repeat once again, the universal unit of measure for ocean freight is the cubic meter, a CBM, as it's referred to. When working with full container load shipments, 40 footers, 40 high cubes, 45 footers, the total ocean freight cost must be expressed by the cubic meter. But again, it's not just the port-to-port ocean freight. There's bunker surcharge, there's terminal handling fees. We need to lump those all together and then come to a per cubic meter figure. The third bullet on this slide is very, very critical. When prorating ocean freight charges on an item-specific basis, the key is to determine how many units of an item fit into a cubic meter. Let's say that again. And this is precisely why we talk about important things like case pack quantity, like the dimensions and weight of a carton. Again, the key is to determine how many units of an item fit into a cubic meter. Is it a case pack quantity of 1 that happens to take up, as a carton, 1 cubic meter? Or is it a case pack quantity of 50, the equivalent of which fit into a cubic meter? These are the things we need to know. A quick trade tip related to converting from the metric system to standard. 1 cubic meter, to give people an idea in the United States of how much space we're talking about, equals 35.314 cubic feet. Moving along with the steps for calculating landed cost specific to ocean transportation, in preparing that average cost per CBM, it is important to identify the types and quantities of container sizes used. Specifically, the number of 40 footers, 40 high cube, and or 45-foot containers used in a year by a given importer. It should be noted that while we're talking about different container sizes, it's not out of the ordinary to see an importer use a variety of different containers, depending on the nature of the product. The heavier the product, the less likely that an importer is going to use a 45-foot container. Why is that? Because the goods will reach the weight limitations of a container long before they reach the space limitations of a container. That's really why some importers use 20-foot containers, because they happen to be importing very heavy cargo. It wouldn't make sense for them to use a 40-foot container because, again, they'd max out the weight capacity of the container long before the space. The more voluminous the cargo, it takes up a lot of space but doesn't weigh very much, the greater the likelihood that 40 high cubes and 45-foot containers will be used. As we've said a number of times, it is equally important to ascertain the average utilization of each container type. You'll note again that we're using the word average. We saw it in the first bullet point. We see it in the second bullet point. Averages are not optimal for international trade, but sometimes we don't have a choice. When we're talking about the utilization of a container, as we see in our sub-bullet point, we're talking about what percentage of the space in a container that is actually utilized. And along those lines, it is fairly common to see importers getting 80% utilization out of a container, 85% utilization. In fact, one way to drive down landed cost over time is to make better use of the container space available. More on that further down the path. As a trade tip, and consistent with the idea of maximizing container utilization, experienced importers have minimum container utilization rules in place with their vendors. Which is to say, if a vendor doesn't have at least 55 cubic meters of cargo to put in a 40-foot container, they have to wait till they make some more merchandise. Same can be said for high cubes. Same can be said for 45-footers. It's normal for importers to have those container utilization rules in place, expressed on a per cubic meter basis. On the low end, 55 cubic meters for a 40-footer, 60 cubic meters for a 40-foot high cube. Depends on the importer, depends on what they can agree to with the overseas supplier, but it is a best practice to have minimum container utilization requirements in place. Let's talk some more about this idea of container utilization in the form of a supply chain perspective entitled, oddly enough, Container Utilization and Landed Cost. Another factor that must be taken into consideration when calculating landed cost is the concept of container utilization. Equally applicable to both ocean freight and domestic truck and/or rail transportation, utilization comes down to how much of the available weight or space in a given container is actually taken up by merchandise. Again, containers are going to have a weight limitation and a space limitation. Knowledge of container utilization throughout the year is important for landed costs for a number of reasons. With regard to ocean freight, when full container load shipments are used, the U.S. importer pays for the use of the entire container, regardless of whether or not it is full. This means that the more merchandise that can be loaded into a container, the less the prorated item-specific unit cost will be. While this concept makes a lot of sense and sounds easy, it is not so easy to do. There are a number of reasons why the space capacity of an ocean container might be underutilized, most of which can be worked on as a continuous improvement initiative with the supplier. For example, an overseas vendor simply may not have enough merchandise to fill a container. If the importer can wait, the supplier can be required to put more merchandise in that container as they produce it. Conversely, and this is fairly common, a vendor may pallet load a container versus floor load, which creates a lot of dead space in the container. Pallet loading is convenient when the goods arrive at destination because the container can be offloaded more quickly. But as you might imagine, the importer is going to lose space in that container, not only because the pallets take up space on the floor, but depending on the nature and configuration of the cargo, pallets may not be easy to stack in an ocean container, so the importer is going to lose all that space as well. Dead space, just as a definition, it is unused space in a container. And if it's full container load, the importer is going to pay the same price whether there's 1 carton in a container or 8,000 cartons in a container. For these and other reasons, U.S. importers should have clear policies in place, as we said, for the minimum number of cubic meters required for specific container sizes. Let's move along with this perspective on ocean transportation, identifying other ocean transportation related charges that must be accounted for in that landed cost calculation. Origin drayage to the port of export. That's the inland freight to go from the factory overseas to the port of loading, the port of export. Origin terminal charges, port security surcharge, importer security filing 10+2. We're becoming somewhat repetitive here, but that is intentional because we must identify all of the inputs that go into making up the landed cost calculation. The base ocean freight, that's the port-to-port ocean freight charge. Bunker surcharge, once again, bunker being the type of diesel fuel that ships burn today. Some more obscure charges, LSS as it's referred to, a low sulfur surcharge. Steamship lines are mandated to use bunker that has a low sulfur content. It becomes more expensive to do that. That type of bunker is more expensive. The steamship lines are going to pass that increase in expense along in the form of a low sulfur surcharge. any documentation charges from the carrier, the steamship line, documentation charges from the forwarder as well, destination terminal charges at the ports here in the United States, destination drayage, that's the short haul trucking from the port of arrival, and the drayage of ocean containers to a destination probably not too far from the port, chassis fees, which are daily rental fees for the chassis that carry the ocean containers, and as we've noted a couple of times and even went through a supply chain perspective on, demurrage and or detention. That can be a real killer from a financial perspective. We'll wrap up this slide with a trade tip and say that whereas carriers do offer all-in rates, importers should require itemized pricing for purposes of quotes and bids. What does that mean? That we can go to a carrier, a steamship line, or an ocean freight forwarder and get offered an all-in rate. $3,000 for a 40-foot container from the port of Santos to the port of Charleston, South Carolina. All in. Well, that's good, but what does all in really mean? We want a breakdown of what all the inclusions are in that all-in rate, because sometimes all in really doesn't mean all in, and if we don't identify all of the all-in costs plus any extra costs, we know that our landed cost calculation is going to be wrong. Okay, that was the build-up to our more detailed case study. And when we come back, that is precisely what we're going to get into. You might want to bring a calculator along for the remainder of this module.